A black CEO was ambushed on live TV, but his response was so sharp, so devastating, that even the audience turned against the host. The studio lights bathed the modern, sleek set of the Sterling Hour in a soft glow. It was one of the country's most watched morning shows, the kind suburban households kept on in the background while sipping coffee and scrolling through their phones. At the heart of it all sat Valerie Sterling, a host as polished as she was formidable. Her sharp features and effortless charisma had made her both respected and feared in the industry. She had built her reputation on hard-hitting interviews, dismantling politicians, grilling Hollywood elites, and catching CEOs off guard with questions they never saw coming. Today, her guest was Malcolm Cain, the founder and CEO of Sentient Dynamics. More than just a successful businessman, he was the face of a new technological era. His company had revolutionized industries, reshaping hospitals, law enforcement, and financial markets with cutting-edge AI innovations. But none of that was what made this interview so highly anticipated. No, the real reason the audience sat in hushed expectation was unspoken but undeniable. Malcolm Cain was a black man in a world historically dominated by white faces, and that alone made him a target for scrutiny, subtle but razor-sharp. Dressed in a crisp navy suit, Malcolm sat poised, his expression unreadable as the countdown to live broadcast began. No nervous tics, no restless hands. He had been here before. He had faced people like Valerie before. Across from him. Valerie crossed her legs and flashed her signature smile. Warm on the surface but edged with a sharpness only the observant would catch. The red light of the camera flicked on. Her voice, smooth and practiced, filled the studio. Good morning, everyone. Today, we have a fascinating conversation ahead. Our guest is a man who has built one of the most influential companies of our time, shaping the way we interact with artificial intelligence. But with power comes responsibility and controversy. She turned to Malcolm, locking eyes. Mr. Cain, thank you for being here. Malcolm gave a slight nod. Appreciate the invitation. Valerie's smile widened, just enough to flash teeth. Let's get right into it. Your rise has been nothing short of remarkable. Some might even say unprecedented. Many look at your success and wonder, is it a testament to merit? Or is it the result of a system trying to correct past injustices? The words were laced with something more than curiosity, a challenge, a trap, a question not meant to be answered, but to provoke. Malcolm exhaled slowly, already recognizing the game she was playing. But what Valerie didn't know was that he had already won before she even started. The audience, though, they weren't ready for what was about to happen next. Malcolm's expression remained neutral. But inside, he was already calculating. He had faced tougher rooms than this, boardrooms where billions were at stake, investors whose skepticism was barely concealed, men who glanced at his skin before his credentials. Valerie Sterling? She was just another test. The silence stretched a second too long, thick enough for the audience to feel it. Then finally he spoke. That's an interesting way to phrase it, Malcolm said, his tone smooth, measured. Are you asking if I earned my success, or if it was handed to me? Valerie let out a short, rehearsed laugh, the kind meant to make a guest feel foolish for even implying such a thing. Oh, not at all, Malcolm. I'm simply saying we live in a time where companies are prioritizing diversity initiatives, and of course, that's a good thing. But some people, our viewers included, might wonder, do programs like these tilt the playing field in a way that benefits some more than others? A murmur rippled through the audience. The tension in the studio shifted, subtle but undeniable. The kind of moment where viewers at home would lean in just a little closer. Malcolm didn't flinch. His shoulders didn't stiffen. He didn't give her the satisfaction. Instead, he tilted his head slightly as if considering something. Let's break that down, he said evenly. You're suggesting that efforts to include historically excluded talent somehow erase merit. But if that were true, why is it that when I walk into a room full of CEOs, I'm still the only one who looks like me? The words landed with weight. For the first time, Madeline's composure flickered. Well, it's a complicated issue, she began. But Malcolm wasn't done. Is it? He asked, his voice still calm. Because it sounds pretty simple to me. What's actually happening is that, for the first time, people who have always been qualified are finally getting their shot. But when someone like me rises to the top, no one asks how many hours I worked, how many sacrifices I made, how many nights I spent building something from the ground up. Instead, they ask, did the system give you a handout? A single clap rang out from the audience, sharp and defiant. Before it was quickly swallowed by silence, Madeline straightened in her seat, regaining her composure. I think what people are really wondering— No, Malcolm cut in, his voice smooth, unwavering. I think what you're wondering is if I deserve to be here. For the first time, Madeline's polished exterior cracked, her signature smile faltering. Just slightly, but enough for the cameras to catch. Malcolm leaned back, crossing one leg over the other, completely unfazed. I get it, he continued, his tone shifting, almost conversational. It's easier to believe that someone like me was handed an opportunity than to admit the system kept people like me out for generations. His voice was steady, controlled, but the weight of his words pressed against the room. But here's the thing, Madeline. He held her gaze. I don't need anyone's permission to sit at this table. The room felt smaller now, the air tighter. The audience wasn't restless, but they weren't at ease either. Madeline's smile returned, but this time it was thinner, stretched too tight. She needed to regain control. This was her show. She let out a light chuckle, shaking her head as if this was just another friendly intellectual debate. Not a moment that had millions of viewers hanging on to every word. Malcolm, she said, her voice dipping into that condescending tone used by people who think they're being subtle. I think you're misunderstanding me. No one is questioning your intelligence or talent. You've built something incredible. But in this country, we do have to acknowledge that certain initiatives, such as diversity hiring, have changed the way businesses operate. And while the intention is good, some believe that these policies sometimes elevate less qualified individuals over those who may have been better suited for the role. Do you see how that could be a concern? There it was. She wasn't bothering to hide it anymore. Malcolm inhaled slowly, not out of frustration, but with the patience of someone who had heard this argument too many times before, always from people who believed they were saying something new. He nodded once. I see exactly what you're saying. Then he leaned in slightly. But let me ask you this. When was the last time someone sat across from a white CEO and asked if they really deserved their position? A flicker of hesitation crossed Madeline's face. When was the last time a Fortune 500 company hired an average white man, and someone turned around and said, maybe he didn't earn it. Maybe he's just here because the system helped people like him. Madeline opened her mouth, but Malcolm wasn't finished. Because if we're going to talk about unearned opportunities, then let's be honest about where that conversation really belongs. His voice remained calm, but the truth in his words hit like a hammer. For decades, centuries even, companies have been run by men who all look the same. And no one ever questioned whether they deserved to be there. No one ever said, hey, maybe that CEO got a head start because his father was in the same industry. Or, maybe that executive was promoted because he went to the right country club instead of working harder than everyone else. The silence in the studio was absolute. The audience was no longer just listening, they were absorbing. Malcolm tilted his head slightly, studying Madeline. So why is it That when someone like me succeeds, now we suddenly want to have a conversation about merit. Madeline swallowed. She could feel the shift, not just in the room, but on screens across the country. But she wasn't ready to back down. She forced out a small chuckle, attempting to steady herself. I think we're getting a little off track here. Are we? Malcolm asked, his voice even. Because it seems to me we're finally on the right track. The tension had evolved into something sharper now, electric, and then Madeline made the mistake. Well, she said, her tone cooling, measured, I think some people might argue that in industries like yours, companies do lower the bar to meet certain expectations. The air in the room shifted. A collective inhale. A line had been crossed. Malcolm didn't flinch, didn't blink. He simply looked at her, studied her. Then he leaned forward, resting his hands on his knee, and spoke calmly. If you think the bar has been lowered, then let's raise it, right here, right now. The camera zoomed in. The audience was holding their breath. But no one, not even Madeline, was ready for what he was about to say next. Malcolm's words lingered in the air, thick as a storm about to break. Madeline's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. She wasn't used to this. She had expected pushback, maybe even a heated debate. But not this. Not a challenge, not a debate. What Malcolm had just done was something else entirely. Precision, control, and a direct hit Madeline hadn't anticipated. He let the silence stretch, not out of hesitation, but out of intention. Then he spoke again, his voice calm, deliberate. You say the bar has been lowered. Let's test that. He turned slightly, not just addressing Madeline anymore, but the millions watching from their living rooms, office cubicles, and coffee shops. Earlier, you suggested that diversity initiatives might be giving opportunities to people who don't deserve them. But let's look at the numbers. He gestured subtly, controlled. Right now, there are exactly 6 black CEOs in the Fortune 500 out of 500. That's just over 1%. He let that sink in. Let the weight of the statistics settle into the room. Now tell me, if the bar were really being lowered to make room for people like me, wouldn't those numbers look a little different? A murmur rippled through the studio audience. Madeline's fingers twitched, just slightly, against the cue cards in front of her. But she didn't interrupt. Malcolm leaned back, his voice steady. You know what I had to do to get here, Madeline? His tone wasn't angry, it wasn't defensive. It was a simple, cutting truth. I had to build a company from nothing. I had to pitch investors who assumed I was the assistant when I walked into the room. I had to outperform my competition 10 times over. Because I knew that if I failed, I wouldn't just be seen as Malcolm Cain failing. I'd be seen as proof that people like me don't belong in this space. He let that hang, the weight of it pressing against the walls. Then, he continued, meanwhile, there are executives, right now, sitting at the top of billion-dollar corporations because their father made a few phone calls and nobody questions whether they belong. Something shifted. The audience wasn't just listening anymore. They were absorbing. Madeline felt it. She straightened, fingers smoothing the papers in front of her, reaching for control. Malcolm, she tried, her voice measured. I think you're making some broad generalizations. No one is denying that you've worked hard. But the reality, Malcolm cut in smoothly, is that people only ask these questions when someone who looks like me succeeds. Madeline's lips parted, but no sound came. When a white executive takes the helm of a major company, no one assumes they got there because of a diversity initiative. No one ever turns to them and asks, Hey, do you think you got this job because someone lowered the bar? The question hung in the air. A mirror turned back on her. Madeline tried to form a response, but for the first time she couldn't find one. Malcolm exhaled lightly through his nose, shaking his head just slightly. Then, with quiet precision, he delivered the final blow. "You don't actually care about merit." He looked her in the eye. "You care about keeping people like me from having a seat at the table?" A pause. "And that, Madeline, is the real conversation." The silence was deafening. Madeline Sterling, polished, composed, untouchable, had just cracked. Not much, just enough. But enough was all it took. The camera caught it. The audience saw it. The millions watching at home would rewind and replay it, just to confirm what they thought they saw. For the first time in her career, Madeline looked rattled. Not overtly, not dramatically, but it was there. A tiny shift in her posture, a slight loss of footing, and it was damning. She forced herself to recover. She had to. "Well, Malcolm," she began, her voice softer now, careful, "I think we can all agree that these conversations are nuanced. No one is saying you haven't worked hard." Malcolm smiled, but it wasn't the kind of smile that signaled agreement. It was the kind that said, "I see exactly what you're doing, except that's exactly what you're saying." His voice was smooth, unshaken. "You didn't bring me here to talk about my company. You didn't want to discuss the technology we're developing, the ways it's shaping the future." A small pause. "No, you brought me here to ask if I truly earned my place." He met her gaze, unwavering. "And that question, Madeline, is the problem." Madeline inhaled sharply, but Malcolm wasn't finished. "You see, when people like me succeed, people like you feel the need to investigate. People like you succeed, and no one questions it." Malcolm's voice remained steady, unwavering. He never raised it. He didn't need to. Yet somehow he had turned the entire interview into something Madeline never anticipated. A reckoning, a lesson. "I've spent my entire career proving myself to people who started 10 steps ahead of me." His eyes stayed locked on hers. "And I'll keep doing it. Not because I need their validation, but because I refuse to let the next generation of people who look like me grow up thinking they have to apologize for their own success." The audience reacted before Madeline could. A few hesitant claps at first. Then more. Then a wave of applause. Not the polite kind, but the kind that meant something. A statement. Madeline flicked a glance toward the control booth, likely searching for a lifeline. There wasn't one. Not this time. She forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Well," she said, clearing her throat, "we certainly appreciate your perspective." It was a weak ending to a battle she had already lost. Malcolm didn't gloat. He didn't smirk. He simply sat back, composed, letting the moment breathe, because nothing else needed to be said. But outside that studio, the real storm was just beginning. The moment the interview ended, Madeline Sterling didn't linger. She gave a quick, tight-lipped smile, muttered something about appreciating the conversation, and turned away, before the cameras had even faded to black. Malcolm, on the other hand, took his time. He rose from his chair with ease, adjusted his suit jacket, and shook hands with the producers and crew, as if nothing had happened. But something had happened. Something irreversible. By the time he stepped into the hallway, his phone was already vibrating nonstop. Texts, emails, notifications. His assistant, Jordan, was waiting by the green room door, eyes wide. "You've seen it already?" Malcolm asked, barely amused. Jordan turned his phone around. "It's everywhere." And it was. Clips of the exchange were flooding social media at a speed no PR team could contain. The hashtag, Drummer Malcolm Cain, was already trending. Right behind it? Sterling exposed and Sard lower the bar, the very phrase he had flipped back on Madeline, now being used as a rallying cry. Memes were popping up by the second. One side of the internet was celebrating, calling it one of the most satisfying takedowns in television history. The other side? Scrambling, spinning, damage control. Malcolm scrolled through his phone as they walked, catching glimpses of the chaos. A viral tweet. Valerie Sterling just learned in real time that some men come prepared for the ambush. Absolute Masterclass by Malcolm Cain. A YouTube clip. This is what happens when you challenge a man who built his empire from the ground up. Watch until the end. She had nothing left. And then, of course, the counterattacks. A certain network's headline. Did Malcolm Cain bully a female host on live TV? A debate or a public shaming? Malcolm exhaled through his nose. Predictable. He'd been in this game long enough to know that when people lost an argument, they tried to rewrite it. Jordan shook his head, still scrolling. Sterling's team is in full damage control. They're saying she was just asking tough questions and that you overreacted. Malcolm gave a low chuckle, slipping his phone into his pocket. Of course they are. But the world had already made up its mind. That night, the Sterling Hour's official YouTube channel uploaded the full interview. Not an edited version, not the carefully clipped, PR-approved highlights. The whole thing, uncut. Within 2 hours, it was the #1 trending video. By morning, 12 million views. Corporate America was watching. Media executives were watching. Madeline's sponsors were definitely watching. And for the first time, she was the one under scrutiny. This wasn't just about a bad interview anymore. It was about a long-standing pattern being dragged into the light. Meanwhile, Malcolm's inbox was filling up, but not with backlash. Opportunities, speaking requests, interviews, a feature in a major business magazine. People weren't just praising his performance. They wanted to hear more. And deep down, Valerie Sterling knew it. Malcolm understood this wasn't just a fleeting sensation. It was the start of something far greater. As soon as the interview wrapped up, Valerie Sterling didn't stick around. She forced a brief, tight-lipped smile, murmured a vague appreciation for the discussion, and walked off, disappearing before the cameras had even faded to black. Malcolm, however, remained composed. He rose with deliberate poise, adjusted his suit jacket, and exchanged firm handshakes with the crew and producers, showing no sign of the impact that had just unfolded. But the moment was irreversible. By the time he reached the hallway, his phone was buzzing relentlessly. Messages, emails, notifications stacking up faster than he could check them. Waiting by the green room door, his assistant, Jordan, stood wide-eyed. "You've seen it already?" Malcolm asked, barely entertained. Jordan flipped his screen toward him. "It's everywhere." And it was. Clips of the confrontation had overtaken social media, spreading at a pace no PR team could rein in. Malcolm Cain was dominating the trends, immediately followed by Sterling exposed and lower the bar, a phrase he had thrown back at Madeline now being championed as a slogan. Memes flooded timelines. One side of the internet celebrated, hailing it as one of the most satisfying takedowns on live television. The other side scrambled, frantically spinning damage control, twisting the narrative to suit their agenda. Malcolm scrolled through the chaos, catching fragments of the storm. A viral tweet. Valerie Sterling just learned in real time that some men don't fall for the setup. Absolute Masterclass by Malcolm Cain. A YouTube clip. Watch what happens when you challenge a man who built everything himself. She had no comeback. Then came the counterattacks, a headline from a familiar network. Did Malcolm Cain humiliate a female host on live TV? Debate or public shaming? Malcolm exhaled through his nose. Predictable. He'd played this game long enough to know that when people lost an argument, they tried to rewrite it. Jordan shook his head, still scrolling. Sterling's team is on full damage control. They're saying she was just asking tough questions and that you overreacted. Malcolm chuckled, slipping his phone into his pocket. Of course they are. But public opinion had already spoken. That night, the Sterling Hour's official YouTube channel uploaded the full interview, unedited, unfiltered, uncut. Within 2 hours, it was the #1 trending video. By morning, it had racked up 12 million views. Corporate executives were watching. Media powerhouses were paying attention. Madeline's sponsors undoubtedly scrutinizing. For once, she was the one under fire. This wasn't just about a failed interview anymore. It was about a long-standing pattern being exposed for the world to see. Meanwhile, Malcolm's inbox was filling with something entirely different. Opportunities, speaking invitations, interviews, a feature in a top business magazine. People weren't just impressed by his response. They wanted to hear more. And deep down, he knew this was only the beginning.